Good evening. What a great pleasure to be here tonight amongst you all. My name is Simone Rodin-Benzaken. I'm the director of AJC Europe and AJC Paris. I would really like to start out by thanking Yossi Klein-Halevi. I think I'm not the only one who has thought that his speech was incredible food for thought for the next 110 years to come. Now, in this next roundtable, we will continue to look towards the future, because we as AJC, for the last 110 years, we have always tried to anticipate where we're going, where the world is going. For us as Jews all around the world, for Israel, and for pluralistic and democratic values. So I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming the next panel here today, who I am certain will give us food for thought and will inspire our way of thinking for the next 110 years to come. So please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Goldberg, national correspondent of The Atlantic, Julia Ioffe, contributing writer at Politico, and Richard Haass, president of the Council of Foreign Relations. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It is such a great pleasure to be here with you. So, Richard, let's start out with some sort of general question. And what I would like to ask you is, the world is changing rapidly. You yourself have spoken about world disorder. But when you're trying to look ahead, what do you think we as an organization, as global Jewish advocates, who are interested, obviously, in Israel and Jewish communities around the world and the way the world is changing and pluralistic and democratic values, what do we need to think about in terms of dangers and in terms of opportunities?
Unfortunately, there's probably more dangers than opportunities right now. My kids call me Debbie Downer, and you're about to understand why. But when you think about it, here we are. I mean, Yossi was just talking, we're nearly half a century after the '67 war, but we're a quarter of a century after the end of the Cold War. And what are we seeing? We're seeing the revival of the dynamics of great power rivalry. We are seeing the reality of an enormous gap between a host of global challenges, from what to do about cyber, to what to do about disease, to what to do about proliferation, to trade. The gap between these challenges and the responses that the world is able to generate. The Middle East, which I expect we'll all be talking about, is as close to chaos as any of us would ever want to see. You've got the return of geopolitics to Europe and the beginnings of significant geopolitics in the Asia-Pacific, which is the part of the world that more than any other will determine the character of the 21st century. And this is all taking place against a backdrop of many countries, including our own, the United States, which are increasingly divided and looking inward, and in which a lot of the things we thought that were givens are no longer there, and there's no longer consensus about the importance of the world, much less what we are to do about it. So when you ask what can be done, one can work on multiple levels, and I think the AJC is doing it. One is to promote involvement in various policy debates. Second, to generate a new generation that's involved in these issues. But I would think more than anything, and I've actually made it the priority for my organization, the Council on Foreign Relations, is to produce a next generation that understands why the world matters, that isolationism is not a serious or a wise option, and that will try to promote involvement, that whether it's strategic, political, economic, military, what have you, in the world that essentially will understand that, that this society, or indeed no society, can be walled off. There's no gated communities in a global world, and that there needs to be serious involvement. I just say 10 more seconds. The Middle East is a little bit of a warning about what happens when global involvement essentially falls off. And it's a stark lesson that the world, for those of you who took Economics 101, there's no invisible hand in the geopolitical marketplace. The world doesn't sort itself out. Left to its own devices, to the contrary, it increasingly unravels. We're seeing that to a dangerous degree in the Middle East. It's a serious topic is what to do about it, but it's still not too late to prevent that from happening in other parts of the world. That ought to be the focus.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Jeffrey, actually responding to what Richard just said, you spent time with President Obama. You wrote a very long article in The Atlantic. And one of the things that sort of came out of it was the view of President Obama that the place that the United States has been playing in the world has or will be, or it has changed. How do you, first of all, can you speak a little bit about this? And second of all, where do you see this going? Where do you see the place of the United States in the world?
That's a big question.
It is a big question.
I would say this to start off. One of the interesting aspects of these conversations I had with President Obama was his what came out was his distaste for the Middle East. That he views himself as playing an almost heroic role in trying to limit American exposure to the Middle East, because he's come to the conclusion that America can't win in the Middle East no matter what we do. And he's also come to the conclusion, and you could argue that this is a rationalization for his first conclusion, he's come to the conclusion that it's not as important as it used to be, and that what's important is Asia. Asia is the future, and we don't pay enough attention to Latin America, we don't pay enough attention to Africa. So he's come to that, and obviously he's a bit of a gambler, because we're going to find out maybe in 10, maybe in 15, maybe in 3 years, whether the Iran deal, which was designed to move us out of the Middle East, it was designed to neutralize a threat and let us pivot away. We'll find out whether his decision not to go deeper into Syria was the right decision or the wrong decision. But he remains an internationalist in a lot of ways. You can pick apart the choices that he's made and the priorities that he's made, and Richard and I can go, and Julia too, obviously with Russia, can go back and forth on that all day. What's interesting though is that he's still within the parameters of what you might consider to be the foreign policy establishment. He has a lot of gripes about the foreign policy establishment. I think that's just because he doesn't like Richard personally, but I'm not sure. Remains to be seen. But no, he thinks that the foreign policy establishment leans too heavily on military engagement, and it is too interventionist in its mindset. But compared to some of the dialogue that we're having now in the United States in the election season about what America's role should be, he's still within a certain establishment framework. Where we're going, it kind of depends on what the American voter does 5 months from now. We can go, I'm going to try to be extremely careful right now. I'm probably going to fail. But, there is a strong isolationist streak. Maybe isolationist is too strong a word, but there is this, as Richard points out, there's this turn inward. There's this belief that we don't have to be engaged in the world. Walter Russell Mead calls it this Jacksonian impulse, which is Americans want to be left alone. If somebody messes with us, we'll go kill you, but otherwise stay over there, stay behind a wall, as it were, and leave us alone. And no, this is what's happening as part of a continuing. This is not new. These feelings are not new. The basic point I would make, and I'll finish on this. The basic point I would make is that there is a fundamental misunderstanding about the choice to be involved in the world or not be involved in the world. There is no actual choice. there are three key regions of the world for the United States right now: East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. If the United States withdraws from any of these regions, the vacuum that is created by that withdrawal is not filled by better actors than the United States. It's China, it's Russia, it's Iran, some combination of Iran and Sunni extremism. And so that is the choice that's facing the United States in the coming years. Do you cede this role that we've played since the end of World War II? We've established the international rules. Do we stop doing that, and do we let other people fill in that gap? Or do we continue to fulfill our international responsibilities, which, by the way, are in our own benefit, not just the benefit of others?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Julia, speaking about the vacuum, you actually just came back from Russia. You're an expert on Russia. You have lived in Russia. I would be interested in trying to understand and get your point of view on where do you see Russia going in filling the vacuum, both in the Middle East and also maybe in the rest of the region that surrounds Russia, in Eastern Europe. What is, from your point of view, what is sort of the strategy, the thinking behind President Putin?
Before I answer that, I just wanted to, on a personal note, thank AJC. I'm one of the Soviet Jews for whom you campaigned 20-some years ago. So, it's a little bit surreal to be here, but thank you to everybody who participated in that campaign way back when. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you guys. As for where Russia's going, I think we're going to be seeing, I mean, it's a fool's errand to try to predict where they're going to go next and what they're going to do specifically. But I think the general trajectory that we've seen over the last couple of years since Putin came back for his third term is going to hold, which is trying to push into areas that the US is increasingly leaving behind, like the Middle East, like parts of Europe. What I just saw in Russia was, I was there reporting a story about the first post-Soviet generation. It'll be 25 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union this December. And the people born after 1991 are people who have been conditioned, and the younger they are, the better conditioned they are, to tolerate a great amount of hardship at home, to see an ascendant Russia abroad. You know, for a 17-year-old, it's okay to not get fancy Italian cheese as long as people deal with Russia in a respectful way and come to Russia to sort out global problems. We've seen the ruble crater. We've seen the Russian economy sink to unprecedented depths. This is the first year that Russian spending on medicine has dropped since it's, people have been keeping count. And this is all in the service of, we're tightening our belts in order to pursue our adventures abroad. And that means upholding actors like Assad. It means upholding actors like Saddam Hussein way back when. Like Jeffrey said, this is not a better actor than the US. And Russians are prepared to tolerate this at home. Like the hardship that comes from this kind of foreign policy, the sanctions, the tanking oil price, they're okay with that as long as Russia is ascendant on the world stage. And they're kind of primed for blood at this point. They want to see more of it. The concert that a Russian symphony orchestra had in Palmyra after it was recaptured from ISIS is similar to the concert that Russia gave in South Ossetia after it bit off that chunk off of Georgia. This is something that is very much in Putin's playbook. We're going to see a lot more of it in the future, I think, especially if the US continues to pull back. And what you're seeing in the Russian media, which is controlled by the Kremlin, is an active throwing in for Donald Trump. And I'm not saying, I'm not going to weigh in politically, but I'm just telling you that the Kremlin has weighed in politically, and pretty much every news broadcast is talking about how Trump is great and Trump is going to reestablish a friendship with Russia. And really what that means is that America is going to beat a retreat. It's going to become more isolationist, which will give more room to Russia to maneuver. Hillary is evil and a warmonger, and she hates Russia. Bernie Sanders is good for attacking her from the left. So the Kremlin is very clear on who it wants to win.
So, Richard, I would be interested.
Are those boos or applause?
In the context of the presidential election,
There's an election going on. Thank you.
apparently it seems so.
Yeah.
We even get the information then on the other side of the Atlantic. Where do you see the role, to come back to this question I also asked to Jeffrey, where do you see in this context, after the election, where do you see the standing of the United States? Do you feel that there's going to be a more internationalist outlook or more retreat? And where do you see the population, the American public, wanting to go? I can tell you clearly that in all of our meetings and all of the chancellors across the world, the first question is always, where is the United States and where will it be?
Sure. Put aside for a second who's the 45th president of the United States, because that individual will obviously matter a great deal. In some ways, he or she will matter more in foreign policy than in domestic policy, given the political and constitutional framework here that gives the president and the commander-in-chief more leeway in foreign affairs than in domestic affairs. But I think the underlying trends are anti-interventionist. I wouldn't use the word isolationist, that's way too strong. But if you look at two of the three candidates, Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders, Donald Trump, both have what I would use, the word I feel more comfortable with is a minimalist view, a restricted view of what it is in America's interest to do in the world. And they are not so much generating that mentality as reflecting it. And you're seeing it in opposition to free trade, which has been a bipartisan endeavor for, what, 3/4 of a century, even somewhat longer. You see them tapping into what I would call the intervention fatigue that understandably set in after both Iraq and Afghanistan, and indeed a major pushback against what I would call wars of choice, particularly wars of choice meant to transform the internal DNA of other societies, which has proved to be more often than not to use the expression of Julius, a fool's errand, something that is often designed in Washington but cannot be implemented on the ground. So I think the underlying instinct of the society will be to be wary of things abroad and to focus on things at home. And the understanding, the second half of that, is that a lot of Americans are suffering from wage stagnation. Middle class wages haven't gone up now for the best part of 15 or 20 years. Inequality is real. More important, upward mobility is much less of a dynamic than it was in this society. People are worried about retirements. There's a lack of a safety net for many Americans. Employment levels, the percentage of Americans employed is still not what it was before 2008. So you add all this up, and it suggests to me a society that is very conscious of things that are not quite right here at home and is wary of various forms of international involvement. Now, obviously, if you have a president like Secretary Clinton, her instincts are more international than if either of the other two gentlemen were to become president. But I think it's fair to say, Simone, the context is one more in the direction of pulling back. There's one of my colleagues, Steve Sustanovich, has written a book about the cycles of American presidents and American involvement in the world. And I think it's fair to say that we've moved out of a cycle of what you might call exertion, where America had an imperial, not imperialist, but an imperial view of reordering the world, which was very much the foreign policy in some ways of George W. Bush, and is much more in a cycle of retrenchment and looking to do less. And I think that is simply the political reality right now.
Thank you very much. Let me just mention one tiny little thing. We're obviously a 501c3 organization, so we don't support any candidates. So I just wanted to mention that.
I work for a 501c3 organization.
So we're all on the same page.
We
on the
don't.
same page.
We don't. You could just go to us. Go on. Say whatever we want. We're easily goatable, right?
Julia.
We're here all night.
Yeah.
Lean in.
Yeah.
Let me take it. Let me take you to maybe a little bit of a personal experience you've had over the last couple of months and weeks. You are very well versed in social media. Social media has obviously changed the world a lot over the last few years. You are a journalist. You're very active on Twitter. I follow you closely, and you have. Unfortunately experienced what in my home country, France, we experience quite a lot as a Jewish organization. You have been subject to anti-Semitism online. Now, overall, social media obviously has great advantages. It shrinks the world, it allows for people to communicate easier, it democratizes information, but it also has the downsides. It has this anti-Semitic elements, the racists, the bigots. It has also the perfect tool for recruiting jihadist fighters from Europe in particular. Where do you see social media going, and what do you think can be done against it or for it, or use it in the right way? And how have you dealt with the issue over the last couple of months?
I'm a ardent First Amendment supporter for obvious reasons. So, for example, when I see anti-Semitic tweets coming my way, I don't block these people. I want to see what they're saying, and often I will take a screenshot and tweet that to show people what's coming my way. I just believe that these people should be out-argued and shouted down rather than blocked, and I think but I think that networks like Facebook and Twitter do have to find a balance between restricting free speech and reining in abuse and harassment and incitement toward violence. Through Twitter, through the web, people found my address, my phone number, and I was getting phone calls and people ordering caskets for me and homicide cleanups to my apartment, which is, that it's a fine line. It's something that we're kind of every step of the way in the development of social media has been uncharted territory, and we're just going further and further into it. I think we'll figure out a way to sort through it, but I think it has to be a fine line between completely shutting these people down, because again, I'd never block these people. I want to know what they're saying. I want to know where I'd rather see them than not see them. I'd rather that they be visible than lurking in corners where they're, I think, far more dangerous.
Jeffrey, you've had similar experiences.
Yeah, I much prefer the Nazis to Hamas, though, for a number of reasons. I'd take something else entirely, obviously, if I were given the choice. No, but I was just thinking about this. We were talking about this before. And this refers back to what Yossi was talking about a little bit. The Nazis are so over the top. The oven stuff. They're not creative
They're really
either.
good at Photoshop.
They Photoshop you in ovens. They Photoshop you in gas chambers. It's really unbelievable. But it's so overt that it's very hard to argue something that you hear on the left side of the spectrum on Twitter and social media, which is, oh no, it's not anti-Semitism, it's anti-Zionism. The thing about so I appreciate the overtness of it in a kind of way, and I find what's actually probably more pernicious. I would associate myself with Yossi's comments that I don't believe that there's a functional difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism if you define anti-Zionism as a belief that the Jews should not have a state. that is an anti-Jewish position to take. But what's happening in the left is huge word games going on about, oh, this is not anti-Semitism, and so I wouldn't say that I find it refreshing that the straightforwardness of the Nazis. The only Nazis, I've said this before, the only Nazis on Twitter that I really fear are the ones who actually know how to spell, because none of them know, they really are terrible spellers, and I assume that a lack of grammar is self-limiting in a kind of way. That Hitler could spell. The question that we did, the question we don't know is how many are there, and what activates it, and how big is this network? Clearly, these are people in the main. I'm sure your stalkers are the same, who, when you go to their accounts, almost invariably have associated themselves in some way or another with Donald Trump. It's just a fact that the Venn diagram is that's what it is. It's the huge overlay. They believe, and this is something that's worthy of more journalistic exploration, they believe, even though Donald Trump has been largely silent on questions about Jews, largely, they believe that somehow Donald Trump is leading to a white nationalist renaissance in America. Their target online are the Jews, though Donald Trump has other groups that he's currently been discussing. Some of you may notice that. And so we're at the very beginning of an interesting and very fraught process of trying to understand what's going on in the sort of this, when you're lifting up these rocks and finding these people, including how many are there. We don't know the answer to that.
Well, what I can say is, unfortunately, we've had in Europe quite a little bit of an experience, and we have seen that these groups are extremely well organized. And I hope that this is not going to be that Europe is not in that sense a laboratory, and that we're now seeing sort of a trend that will develop in the same way.
Could you answer a question for us? Not that I'm trying to seize the microphone here or anything, but could you were on the front lines of fighting Dieudonné, and you're fighting a lot of really vicious Nazi style, neo-Nazi style anti-Semitism, and AJC and other organizations have succeeded to some degree in marginalizing that narrative, that phenomenon in France. And you've done that because France has a different relationship to what we would consider First Amendment issues. What is it that worked in Europe?
No, absolutely. Well, I find myself now in the very strange position of not being a moderator anymore, but yes,
yeah, no,
absolutely.
Sorry.
It's all right.
But I told you I was going to do this beforehand.
The problem is when you speak to a journalist, you automatically transform yourself into a journalist. To be very
Simone was a great help, by the way, to me when I was in Europe doing a series of articles, long articles on European Jewry. AJC plays a very important role in that struggle. I should just say that, even though it sounds like it's a nice thing to say. I'll say it anyway.
Thank you.
And she's at the front. She's at the front of the front line, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, to answer your question, and then I'll go back to my moderating status. We have a different approach to the First Amendment, and I think to a great extent, the reasons why we have been able to marginalize some of those very vile anti-Semites online, like Dieudonné, like Alain Soral, was because we have penalized them, and we have put fines, put them in front of the courts, because we consider that anti-Semitism, incitement to violence, is actually not an opinion; it's a crime. And I think also over the years we've been able to prove that there is a very strict correlation between what is going on social media and actually people dying afterwards. There will obviously be questions, I think, for you in the future. It has been our approach. It doesn't necessarily mean that the United States needs to take the same approach. But for us, where the situation is indeed very, very grave, it has been the only way of combating the problem. So actually, now that we are in Europe, sorry. Yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to interject on that. In the U.S., what I found, and as many women, especially female writers who have been subjected to this kind of harassment online, have found that the law in the U.S. really lags far behind the technology. And so when I was forced to call the police and the police officer came to my home, he literally said, well, we can't do anything until a crime occurs. To which I said, I hope, my parents ask you to reconsider. But there really isn't much that they can do. You can trace these people to a proxy somewhere in France, and you can break through that proxy, and it's a Tor. And under U.S. law, even if you find the exact computer from which these even if anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic speech were made illegal in the U.S., which I don't agree with, even if you found the specific computer from which that tweet was sent, it's basically impossible in an American court to prove that a specific person sent that tweet. So our laws need to kind of catch up, but also take our First Amendment traditions into account.
Thank you. Actually, I can't obviously not talk about Europe.
Go ahead.
Being on my mind all the time. Jeffrey, you wrote this article a couple of years ago where we had many conversations back and forth about whether Jews should or have a future in Europe. Your conclusion at the end of the article, a very long article in which I have to say you went on the ground, you tried to understand really the situation the Jews went through or are going through in Europe. You came to the conclusion that there is no hope for Jews in Europe. I would like to get your understanding 1.5 years later, if you still believe the same thing. That's one thing. And the other thing is, one of the conversations we've had, and one of the things I have always thought, was that anti-Semitism is sort of a symbol and an expression of something much more profound. And that if left unchecked, it will develop into a cancer that affects the rest of society. Which has actually happened now with all of the different attacks going on in France and all the different problems we've had in France. But it can also spread to the rest of liberal democracies, right. Because at the end of the day, if a country like France is incapable of protecting its Jewish minority anymore, what does it mean to the rest of liberal democracies? So my question is again, what do you think is the situation for Jews a year and a half after you wrote the article? And what do you think, do you see things spreading to elsewhere? Right,
well, I mean, I would say this just to start, that not that you would do this, but you and David and other AJC people could go to the leaders of France and say, we told you so. I mean, because you've been telling them for years. And Jews understand this principle, and not enough other people understand the principle that what starts with the Jews doesn't really ever end with the Jews. Right. I mean, the Jews are the test case, and so what's the signal difference in Paris now, for instance, is that no one in Paris thinks that these kind of attacks are going to be limited to Jewish targets. I mean, that was the lesson of Paris, the lesson of Brussels. So a particular Jewish problem, which was never, in fact, just a Jewish problem, it was a proxy for a set of other problems, is now, I think, more generally understood in Europe. It doesn't mean that the lives of Jews are going to be any better or any safer. It just means that the danger has spread. And, I mean, there's a couple of points. There's good work. Richard's organization does good work on this about sort of the. I've seen some stuff on their website recently about the reaction and counter-reaction process that's going on in Europe, in which each time there's an attack, the right gains strength, the far right gains strength, and the center has difficulty holding. I mean, going back to something that Yossi was talking about. I mean, we are living in an age globally in which centrism is under real threat, real challenges. I mean, we have that in this country, you have it in Europe, you have it in Israel, you have it obviously across the Muslim world. It's very interesting in the sense that the story about European Jews is not really about European Jews anymore. It's about the condition of the liberal democracy and openness in Europe. Jews are always the first. It's sort of our luck always to sort of be the test case for these things. I wouldn't say that the Jews are out of any particular danger, I would just say that the problem is not whether Jews have a future in Europe, it's whether Europeans have a future in Europe, that the European project has a future, that the EU has a future. I mean, they're much bigger questions now than just the Jewish issue. Yeah. But I maintain my belief that there are better places to be Jewish than many parts of Europe, and this is something that we've talked about, and I know this is a preoccupation of this organization, is the question I consider the Jewish radar question. Our radar usually doesn't work entirely well, and it's something seems far away, and then it's too close. And so you never actually know when that moment is. What's the tipping point moment when you say, okay, you know what, we've committed ourselves to the Republican ideal in France, let's say, but at this point, it's too much. Nobody knows when that particular moment comes. I know that's your job to figure out.
It is my job to figure it out. Right now, we're staying there and fighting very hard. Richard, just to sum up, and maybe we haven't addressed the issue of Israel yet. A question I'm interested in, and I think that many of us are interested in, is where do you see American-Israel relations going? There has been concern, and I can tell you especially here from Europe, there has been concern that there has been a certain daylight between the American-Israeli relations. Where do you see that going?
30 seconds before that, I just wanted to pick up on something Jeffrey said.
Sure.
The trajectory of Europe is a real issue for concern. 3 years ago, there's zero chance we would have been talking about Europe, particularly in a negative sort of way. And what we've seen with Crimea and the rest of Ukraine, what we've seen now with the massive wave of refugees, we've seen the rise of right-wing parties. You've got prolonged low economic growth. You've got demographic issues. You've got the challenge in 3 weeks of the vote in England and the Brexit vote, which shows the challenge to, the European project. And Europe itself was such an accomplishment. When you think about what happened in the 40s and 50s between Germany and France, what began as the coal and steel community became the European community, became the European Union. The whole idea was to knit Europe together in such a way that you would never again have conflict on a large scale, that it would become unthinkable because the societies and economies would become too integrated. And there was a general trajectory in that direction. And what worries me now, to take a step back, is I see that trajectory under challenge. And rather than Europe becoming more integrated, it's becoming less integrated, and the consensus is moving away from that. It's almost as if people have forgotten some of the historical impulses that got Europe to, in a sense, that wrote 20th century history for worse and for better. And I just think that Europe is in play historically today in ways that we literally could not have imagined only 3 or 4 years ago. It's happened with stunning speed, and I just think it's one of those things I talked before. It's one of the things that we thought was a given, that Europe was basically okay and peaceful and the rest, and suddenly we're waking up to the reality that even Europe is not a given. And I just think that needs to be something that we remain mindful of. You want to say something on this before we get to Israel?
No, just let me just interject very quickly because it's a semi-related.
Very quickly.
Don't worry, it's going to be extremely quick, although it's getting longer by the second. No. It's very interesting because what Richard is describing is that we're living in an amazing time. And what I was thinking of was Julia just mentioned something that's impossible to think about 20 years ago. If you said to somebody 20 years ago that in 2016 the Kremlin would be backing the Republican candidate for president of the United States, they would say, you're on meth, you need help. But we're living in a period in which everything that we've supposed about international stability is out the window.
But I was going to say that especially among the younger generation that doesn't remember a lot of this consensus, especially around foreign affairs, a lot of these things that we grew up with as givens, a peaceful, prosperous Europe, an America where racism and sexism and anti-Semitism doesn't exist, and it's your paranoid grandmother's fantasy. All these things, I personally could not have imagined seeing the kinds of things I've been seeing on Twitter in America in 2016. And I think a lot of people my age and younger who have been seeing it are extremely shocked because they certainly thought that this was a hatred that we'd long ago dealt with, and we're dealing with something else now. And certainly a certain Republican frontrunner has been targeting other groups. But now that this has also come out, I think people have, it's just a lot of givens that are just falling apart into sand.
Thank you, and this will unfortunately have to be the final word. We won't have the time, and I'll ask Richard. I have the privilege to discuss it with Richard backstage, and I'll tell you all about it.
She'll tweet about it. Yeah.
Of course I will. So unfortunately we have to wrap up. Thank you very much. I would like really to thank our panelists.
So cheerful.
So, as I said, as we're continuously trying to anticipate the future, we at AJC, I think this panel sort of showed us that we are doing the right investments. We are combating anti-Semitism in Europe. We are trying to promote an internationalist view of the world. So I think we are on the right path. We have more 110 years to come. And thank you very much.